The trouble began long before the soil shifted, long before the hillside cracked, and long before the neighborhood woke to the rumble that would change everything. It began with the kind of confidence only an HOA board can possess, the kind that turns small ideas into expensive disasters, and calls it community improvement. Their newest brainchild was a terraced landscape project carved directly into the hill that overlooked our street. According to them, it would maximize aesthetic value and increase property desirability. According to anyone with common sense, it was an unstable patch of earth that had no business being carved, drilled, or reshaped. But common sense rarely stands a chance when an HOA labels something a necessary enhancement. At first, the project seemed harmless, just loud machinery, bright vests, and workers constantly blocking the road. I watched from my backyard as crews cut deep into the hill, removing natural vegetation that had held the slope together for decades. Trees were uprooted, deep-rooted shrubs were shaved down, and the hill's natural layers were replaced with neat, decorative retaining walls. The HOA insisted that the engineers had approved the plan, though no one in the neighborhood had actually seen a report. The board had a way of waving away questions with a smugness that suggested they believed they understood the terrain better than the terrain understood itself. I didn't trust the project from the start, not because I was some kind of geology expert, but because the hillside had always been sensitive to heavy rain. Anyone who had lived here more than a season knew the soil carried water poorly. The thick clay-like earth would swell, soften, and shift if disturbed. So when I saw workers drilling anchor rods into the slope at odd angles, and when I saw the board bragging about cost-cutting measures in their newsletters, I knew something wasn't right. But keeping quiet was easier than arguing with the HOA, especially mine, a group known for blaming homeowners for everything from mailbox rust to the shade of green on their lawns. Weeks passed, and the construction continued. The hill looked less like a natural slope and more like a stacked wedding cake made of cut stone and decorative gravel. I overheard one board member telling another how much money they saved by skipping reinforced drainage channels. "The hill doesn't even get that wet," she said. That sentence would later echo in my mind with a sharp bitterness, like a warning ignored until it became catastrophic. Then came the rain. The first storm was gentle, just steady showers and dark clouds stretching over the neighborhood like a blanket. The water soaked into the cut earth, and the hillside swallowed more than anyone expected. What used to be a grassy slope now held water in the spaces where roots had been ripped out. I noticed dark patches spreading across the new retaining walls. Small, at first. Easy to miss. But I saw them. By the second storm, the patches had grown into streaks. The walls were bowing ever so slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if pushed forward by the weight of soaked soil behind them. The HOA dismissed every concern raised by homeowners. They said the walls were settling naturally and that people were overreacting to harmless cosmetic changes. But late at night, I could hear the earth creaking, tiny groans beneath the sound of rain. The kind of sound you only hear when something deep underground is shifting. The final storm came 3 days later. A torrential downpour that hammered the neighborhood from evening until dawn. I hardly slept. I kept looking out the window toward the hill, watching water spill down the new terraces like a funnel. The retaining walls trembled. A thin crack opened across one section, narrow but long, like a vein running down stone. I took a picture. I emailed the HOA. No reply. At 5 a.m., the world moved. It began with a low vibration, like distant thunder. Buried under the ground. Then came a rumble, loud, deep, and unnatural. I rushed to the backyard just in time to see the top terrace give way. The wall collapsed first, breaking apart in chunks. Then the soil behind it surged forward, pushing the lower levels into a cascading wave. The hillside transformed into a river of mud, stone, and debris. It rushed downward toward the houses below, including mine, swallowing fences, tearing through yards, and dragging everything with it. The sound was a mix of cracking earth and sliding stone, terrifying, unstoppable, overwhelming. My backyard vanished in seconds. The mud swept through the lower part of my property, burying half my fence and crushing my shed. Other neighbors weren't as lucky. One lost their entire deck. Another lost an entire patio structure. A few barely escaped when mud hit the back of their homes with enough force to shatter windows. It was chaos, and in the middle of it, the HOA members arrived, shocked, frantic, and completely unprepared for the consequences of their genius planning. But shock didn't last long. Within hours, before the mud had even settled, they began shifting blame. They blamed the contractors. They blamed the unexpected storm. They blamed soil conditions they were never informed of. And then, unbelievably, they blamed me. Because according to them, my unauthorized drainage modifications had redirected water and contributed to the hillside collapse. The so-called drainage modification? A small, standard rain diverter attached legally to my gutter system. Something the HOA had approved years ago. Something they now claimed I installed improperly. Neighbors rallied. Tempers flared. Accusations flew across the street like shrapnel. But the board was stubborn, desperate, and clinging to any narrative that made the disaster anyone's fault but their own. And as the mud dried into hardened layers across the neighborhood, and as emergency crews inspected the damage, I realized something chilling. The HOA wasn't just wrong. They were preparing to make me the scapegoat. And the real fight, the one I never asked for, was only just beginning. The morning after the landslide, the neighborhood looked like a scene from a disaster documentary. Mud clung to every surface, fences leaned at impossible angles, and the air smelled of damp earth and crushed vegetation. Yet amid the physical chaos, the HOA was already mobilizing a different kind of storm, a campaign of deflection, misinformation, and finger-pointing that seemed almost rehearsed. While most residents were still processing the damage and trying to salvage what little remained of their yards, the board was ready to assign blame, and, predictably, their chosen target was me. I was still in shock, standing at the edge of my property where half the backyard had vanished, when the first official notice appeared. It was a letter, crisp and corporate, stamped with the HOA seal. The wording was careful, almost polite, but the message was clear: I was responsible. According to them, my minor drainage diverter, something I had installed years earlier, legally and without incident, had somehow redirected enough water to trigger the collapse. They even cited potential negligence on my part, though they offered no technical explanation. It was a surreal twist. The community that had destroyed itself through hubris was trying to pin the consequences on one homeowner who had done nothing wrong. Neighbors began to approach me cautiously, uncertain whether to sympathize or assume I had been at fault. Some were furious at the HOA, while others, influenced by the board's narrative, whispered questions about my role in the disaster. It was the beginning of an emotional minefield, where fear, misinformation, and self-interest mixed like oil and water. Rumors spread faster than the mud had days ago. And somehow, the narrative of my guilt began to take root before anyone had a chance to examine the facts. Insurance adjusters arrived, cautious and methodical, walking through the damaged properties and noting structural instability. As they assessed the hillside, it became painfully obvious to anyone with an eye for detail: the primary failure was not a minor drainage pipe, it was the hill itself. The retaining walls had been poorly engineered, the soil compacted incorrectly, and the vegetation that normally stabilized the slope had been obliterated for aesthetic appeal. Every professional assessment confirmed what I had known from the start: this disaster was engineered from the top down. Yet the HOA, in their public communications, continued to focus on my unauthorized interference, as if my small gutter modifications had the power to rewrite physics. Emails, letters, and emergency meetings piled up. The board demanded immediate accountability, hinting at legal action while simultaneously downplaying their own negligence. They hired lawyers who drafted statements emphasizing the need for fair distribution of responsibility, which was HOA speak for making me the fall guy. At every neighborhood meeting, their members stood with unearned confidence, waving charts and reports that conveniently ignored the glaring failures of their hillside plan. Their strategy was as predictable as it was infuriating. They would turn neighbors against each other and shift all scrutiny away from the decisions that caused millions of dollars in damage. Meanwhile, life became a surreal balancing act. Salvaging what remained of my property was exhausting. Mud had seeped into every corner, the fence needed complete replacement, and debris littered every surface. I documented everything meticulously, knowing the HOA would likely dispute every fact. Photos, videos, measurements, these became my armor against a bureaucracy determined to rewrite history. Yet every snapshot reminded me of the fragility of both the land and the so-called community standards that had guided these disastrous decisions. But the physical destruction was only half the story. The emotional toll was staggering. Friends and neighbors treated me differently, some avoiding me out of fear of HOA retribution, others scrutinizing my every action. It felt like being trapped in a slow-motion nightmare, where every phone call, email, and casual comment could be weaponized. Social media amplified the tension. Private messages from concerned neighbors mingled with posts by HOA supporters spreading misinformation. The digital world became a second disaster zone, mirroring the chaos outside my door. In the midst of this turmoil, I began uncovering evidence that the board had known the hill was unstable long before the project started. Old engineering reports, buried in HOA archives, described the soil as highly susceptible to erosion and requiring substantial drainage reinforcement. None of these precautions had been implemented. Instead, the board had celebrated cost-saving measures, cutting corners wherever possible. The more I dug, the more absurd it seemed. The HOA's genius plan wasn't just flawed, it was negligent, reckless, and completely predictable in its failure. Yet somehow, in their carefully curated narrative, I was the villain. Tension escalated as the neighborhood braced for the aftermath. Local authorities issued safety warnings, cordoning off dangerous sections of the slope. Engineers were brought in to stabilize what remained, and heavy machinery worked tirelessly to prevent further slides. During all of this, the HOA held meetings, some public, many private, carefully controlling the story. They called it a community review, but it quickly became obvious that these gatherings were more about reputation management than safety. Every suggestion I made, every documented concern I raised, was dismissed or spun as evidence of my alleged culpability. The board's audacity reached its peak when they announced plans to pursue legal action against me. Letters, citations, and notices piled up, each one implying I had caused property damage, endangered lives, and violated HOA rules. The absurdity of being targeted after months of ignoring warnings about a hillside disaster created a surreal sense of injustice. And yet, despite the stress and the mounting paperwork, a quiet determination began to take shape within me. This wasn't just about mud and walls anymore, it was about exposing the truth, protecting my home, and holding the board accountable for their reckless actions. By the end of the second week, the neighborhood had settled into an uneasy limbo. Streets were lined with debris, repairs had begun in scattered locations, and the board continued its campaign of deflection. But I had gathered allies, neighbors who had witnessed the slope fail, engineers who confirmed the negligent design, and friends who refused to let a bureaucracy rewrite reality. The fight that the HOA had forced upon me was growing. And as the board prepared their next move, it became increasingly clear, this wasn't just a landslide in the earth, it was a landslide of accountability waiting to happen. And just as I thought the tension couldn't escalate further, a new development emerged, one that would change everything and set the stage for the final confrontation. It wasn't a storm, a lawyer, or even the HOA's lawyers this time, it was something far more undeniable, far more dramatic, and far more viral. Something that would expose the HOA's genius planning in a way no amount of spin could cover up. And I knew, in that moment, that the real story was about to explode. The tension that had gripped the neighborhood for weeks reached a breaking point the morning the evidence became undeniable. After 2 rounds of inspections, countless reports, and the careful documentation I had compiled, the truth could no longer be ignored. Engineers presented clear, detailed findings, the landslide had been inevitable the moment the hill was restructured, the retaining walls improperly designed, and the drainage ignored. Every calculation, every soil report, and every photograph told the same story. The HOA's genius plan had set disaster in motion, and yet, somehow, for weeks they had tried to convince the community that I, the homeowner who had raised concerns, was responsible. Word began to spread quickly. Neighbors, once hesitant to speak, shared photos and videos on social media. The footage of the collapsing hill, the snapped fences, and the mud-swept properties went viral within the community and then beyond. Comments poured in, many expressing outrage at the audacity of the board. The story that had once been whispered in private meetings was now public knowledge. The HOA could no longer control the narrative. The more they tried, the more the community, and eventually the media, turned against them. It was the ultimate irony. Their obsession with blame shifting had fueled the very scrutiny they feared. By the third week, the landscape of accountability began to take shape. Local news crews arrived, filming the mud-covered chaos and interviewing residents who had witnessed the hill's destruction firsthand. The engineers explained, in terms anyone could understand, exactly how the board's negligence had caused the slide. They highlighted the ignored warnings, the cost-cutting measures that compromised safety, and the absence of reinforced drainage channels that would have prevented the disaster. And everywhere I looked, the HOA members were flustered, defensive, and increasingly desperate. Their carefully constructed image of competence was collapsing as quickly as the hillside had days before. Amid the growing media attention, the HOA attempted one final maneuver. They issued a public statement, carefully worded, claiming that the landslide had been an unforeseeable natural event, and that they were exploring all legal avenues to address liability. The statement omitted key details, the ignored reports, the inadequate engineering, and their previous dismissals of concerned residents, including me. It was a feeble attempt to salvage their reputation, but by now, the community had seen the evidence with their own eyes. The narrative had shifted irreversibly. The board could no longer frame me as the scapegoat, their credibility had cratered along with the hill. Meanwhile, I focused on recovery. My property, though damaged, was now documented with exhaustive records. Contractors began stabilizing the slope, reinforcing foundations, and rebuilding what the mud had claimed. But the most satisfying part wasn't the restoration of fences or gardens, it was the vindication. Every piece of evidence I had collected, every photo and every email, proved that I had been falsely accused. The HOA's attempt to deflect blame onto me was unraveling, and the truth was undeniable. For weeks, I had endured scrutiny, whispers, and hostility, yet the disaster had ultimately revealed the reality. I had been right all along. The climax came when the first official investigation into the HOA's practices was announced. County authorities, after reviewing the engineers' reports and the documentation of damage, determined that the board had acted negligently. Penalties were imposed, fines issued, and a plan for remediation was mandated. In meetings broadcast to the neighborhood and online, HOA members faced questions they could no longer dodge. Every genius decision was scrutinized, every corner cut examined, and every false accusation against me questioned publicly. The board's attempt to rewrite history failed. Spectacularly, in the eyes of the law, the community, and the internet, the truth was clear: the landslide was their fault, and their attempts to blame me were both malicious and absurd. Yet, even as accountability was enforced, the story carried lessons beyond property damage. Neighbors who had once been divided began to unite, forming committees to monitor future projects and ensure safety would no longer be sacrificed for aesthetic ambition. Social trust, fractured by misinformation and blame, slowly began to rebuild. And while the HOA tried to salvage what little dignity remained, the community had witnessed the power of evidence, persistence, and resilience in the face of institutional arrogance. The narrative had shifted completely, and the scapegoat had emerged as the voice of reason amid chaos. In the aftermath, life returned to a cautious normal. Gardens were replanted, fences rebuilt, and the hillside stabilized. The HOA, weakened and publicly shamed, operated under stricter oversight and stricter scrutiny. Meanwhile, I had become a symbol within the neighborhood, a reminder that speaking up, documenting facts, and standing firm against reckless authority could prevent further disasters. The landslide, once a mark of destruction, had become a turning point for accountability and awareness. And as neighbors shared stories of rebuilding, I realized that the narrative they tried to control had completely flipped. The board's genius was no longer celebrated, it was infamous. The final irony was undeniable. The same HOA that had dismissed warnings, cut corners, and blamed a concerned homeowner now had to accept the consequences of their actions publicly. The landslide, which had seemed like an unstoppable force of nature, had actually exposed human error in its purest form. It had revealed arrogance, negligence, and the dangers of ignoring common sense for cosmetic perfection. And in the process, it had vindicated me. After weeks of tension, scrutiny, and absurd blame, the story had come full circle, the mud had settled, the truth had surfaced, and justice, though not without chaos, had been restored. And with that, the neighborhood, scarred but wiser, finally began to heal. The hillside stood reinforced, the lessons etched into every garden and fence post, and the HOA, once untouchable, now served as a cautionary tale for communities everywhere. What began as a simple dispute over aesthetic improvement had grown into a saga of negligence, accountability, and vindication. And through it all, one truth remained clear: sometimes the real genius is standing firm in the face of absurdity, knowing that the earth may shake, the mud may fall, but the truth cannot be buried forever.